It's been a good couple decades since the Nintendo 64 launched worldwide, so let's take a look back at its initial software lineup. Software support was slow going in the early days of the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn, but it felt like new releases were especially rare during the N64's first year on store shelves. And yet many of these games made a huge impact, and remain memorable years later. Let's start at the beginning with a look at the N64's North American and Japanese launch lineups.
It's me, Mario!
Super Mario 64. Has any game been as exhaustively documented as Mario 64? In the 20 plus years since its initial release, fans have figured out how to beat Super Mario 64 without collecting a single star. They've managed to complete major parts of the game without pressing the jump button. And so I figure for this video, we need to get creative.
We need to talk about parallel universes. And if you thought my other tangents were complicated...
Ah, crap, he beat me to it! There's seemingly no aspect of Super Mario 64 that hasn't been analyzed and dissected to its fullest. People love talking about this game. Upon its release in 1996, Super Mario 64 seemingly invented a new genre overnight, and in the years that followed, the 3D platformer's popularity exploded on both the Nintendo 64 and the original PlayStation, with new mascots being born, achieving fame, and going down in flames in record time. But Super Mario 64 didn't spring fully formed from Shigeru Miyamoto's forehead in June of 1996. The 3D platformer genre actually saw its genesis on the original PlayStation, and yet Mario 64's predecessors aren't often talked about these days. Today we're going to look at 4 games that defined the 3D platformer genre before Super Mario 64 launched worldwide and raised the standard. Now, first of all, I'm not going to try and claim that the 3D platformer was invented on the PlayStation. The 1991 Atari ST title Alpha Waves was among the first games to attempt a style of gameplay that incorporated floating platforms in 3D environments. It suffices to say that Alpha Waves didn't revolutionize the industry, and while a handful of PC games from the early 90s featured 3D gameplay in polygonal worlds, few of them took the form of what would nowadays be considered a 3D platformer. One of the first console games to take platforming gameplay into the third dimension was Sugar & Rocket's 1995 PlayStation exclusive Jumping Flash. This one's notable because it represents the first time that many classic platforming elements were rendered in full 3D. Taking control of a super jumping android space bunny named Robert, players hop on enemies, cross bottomless pits, and scoop up collectible items across a broad variety of detailed 3D environments. The way Jumping Flash handles vertical movement within a 3D space is especially brilliant. Whenever you double jump, the camera shifts downward, offering a look at the terrain below. Coupled with Robot's shadow, this allows players to traverse the game's environments quickly and with ease, effectively bringing classic platformer gameplay to the 3D realm and bridging the generational gap. Next up, we have a curiosity that manages to at least look a lot more like Super Mario 64, even if the resemblance is mostly superficial. This is Floating Runner, an all-but-forgotten 3D platformer from Xing Entertainment released for the PS1 in 1996. This is a strange one. At first glance this looks like a platformer, but once you start to play it you'll notice it's really more of a run-and-gun shooter, and the developers made several gameplay concessions just to make the whole thing work in 3D. The control scheme here is what is commonly described as tank controls, as you press left and right to pivot your character, while pressing up moves them forward. You're also not supposed to jump on enemies. Instead, you have this arcing projectile attack that encourages you to engage your opponents from a distance. And unfortunately, there's a lot of enemies, making the clunky combat a major part of the experience. Floating Runner's biggest issue is the way it controls. Whereas a lot of 3D platformers attempt to provide some sort of flow or momentum to gameplay in order to keep players engaged, the controls in Floating Runner are very stiff, and death comes quickly if you're not playing carefully. This results in a slower, clumsier, and ultimately less fulfilling game than Super Mario 64 and its successors. Still, it's at least an interesting failure, and it's definitely worth a play if you want to see what 3D platformers were like in the days before Super Mario 64. Later in 1996, Sony finally debuted a 3D mascot platformer that was specifically engineered to dethrone the kings of the genre. This game shifted classic 2D platformer gameplay to a behind-the-back perspective, leading its designers to unofficially refer to it as Sonic's ass game during development. They later settled on Crash Bandicoot. Nah, I should have stuck with Sonic's ass game. Crash is interesting because its design hinges on technological breakthroughs made during development. Playing Floating Runner and Crash Bandicoot back-to-back really highlights just how much of an impact these techniques had on PS1 platformers going forward. If you ever found yourself wondering why Crash and Spyro have so much more graphical detail than stuff like Jumping Flash and Floating Runner, it's because they use a data streaming technique that constantly spools data in and out of the PlayStation's RAM during gameplay. To see this in action for yourself, try popping the PlayStation's lid open while playing these early platformers. Games like Jumping Flash and Floating Runner load every bit of data that each level requires into RAM before gameplay begins. So even with the lid open, you can continue to play up until the next time the PlayStation needs to read data from the disc, which in this case is either when the level ends or when you get a game over. But if you try opening the PlayStation's lid during a level of Crash Bandicoot, the game will freeze a few seconds later. Why is that? Well, Crash Bandicoot's levels are so dense and packed with detail that it's actually not possible to load an entire level's worth of data into the PlayStation's RAM at once. It just won't fit. So instead, the game constantly loads in data as you progress through each level while dumping out older textures and other elements from previous level segments as needed. This effectively allows the PlayStation to cheat its own RAM limitations. Later 3D platformers like Spyro the Dragon expanded on this technique. Look carefully at these games and you'll notice that many of their environments have narrow passageways or other funneling areas to mask the points at which the PlayStation loads in new data for upcoming level segments. It doesn't look much like it nowadays, but Crash Bandicoot was a revelation at its time of release. It was practically a generational shift in and of itself, and the techniques it used to deliver detailed 3D environments set the standard for what was to come. At its heart, however, Crash Bandicoot is a very straightforward game, owing to its central data streaming tech. There's occasional branching paths, sure, but for the most part the game is a straightforward trek from point A to point B. This approach is pretty demanding in some levels, like the boulder chases and the hog riding sequences. So despite the fact that Sony specifically positioned Crash Bandicoot as a competitor to Nintendo's Mario games, it doesn't really push 3D level design forward in the ways that Super Mario 64 did. In fact, I can only think of one other 1996 PlayStation game that even attempted Mario 64 style of gameplay to any sort of extent. Bubsy 3D. Yep, I went there. Bubsy 3D has a unique place in 3D platformer purgatory. It's got massive, exploration-driven 3D environments, there's plenty of platforms and enemies to jump on. Stylistically at least, it's incredibly close to the kind of gameplay that Mario 64 would later perfect. Now, it's important to note that Super Mario 64 and Bubsy 3D were developed concurrently. In fact, a great deal of work on Bubsy 3D had already been completed before a playable version of Mario 64 was revealed to the public for the first time at the 1996 Consumer Electronics Show. Bubsy creator Michael Berlin was there to see it all unfold right in front of his eyes. He recalls that seeing Mario 64 for the first time was a rude awakening. Specifically, the first two words to come to mind were, "Oh crap." I feel so bad for this guy. Imagine putting several months of work into a game that you knew would be a trendsetter. I mean, with competition from stuff like Floating Runner, you'd have little difficulty standing out from the crowd. And sure, the graphics may be a little primitive compared to Sony's own Crash Bandicoot, but this game's not on rails. It's fully 3D, and finally delivers on the promise of transporting Bubsy to the third dimension. But as history would have it, Super Mario 64 hit North America in September of 1996. Bubsy 3D launched more than a month later on Halloween. It's sad, but by the time Bubsy 3D hit the market, the best thing that people could say about it is that its water levels reminded them of Mario 64. This quote was literally printed on the back of the box. The gulf in quality between Bubsy 3D and Super Mario 64 was so vast that this was among the only critical feedback that could be considered praise. Needless to say, Super Mario 64 turned out to be a huge hit, while Bubsy 3D was mocked on release and became hated as the decades wore on. But in recent years, Bubsy 3D has seen a renaissance of sorts. New speedrun tech reveals that the game is much more coherent and structured than many gave it credit for. Was Bubsy 3D's failure simply a matter of when it hit the market? Is there somehow a solid platformer hiding in there among the grating one-liners and nauseating checkerboard environments? Oh god no, Bubsy 3D plays like a turd. True to the series, Bubsy slips and slides all over the place while you're controlling him, and the mechanics take a page from Floating Runner, giving players tank-style, rotation-based controls. I seriously attempted to see the good here, but it just wasn't happening. So as you might expect from this game, Bubsy spends a lot of his time hopping platforms and crossing gaps. Like in Jumping Flash, the camera tilts downward whenever you jump, helping players stick the landing. But between Bubsy's slip and slide controls and the sheer number of enemies in each level, the game's gonna fight you every step of the way. After spending some quality time with Bubsy 3D, I came away with the conclusion that the game could have been decent if it had fixed up the controls and focused on the platforming instead of the combat. A lot of these levels are just so packed full of enemies that instantly home in on your position and fire projectiles when you're in range. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and worst of all, you're Bubsy. I guess if nothing else, Bubsy 3D's failure serves to highlight just how much Super Mario 64 got right. So what is it that makes Super Mario 64 such a quantum leap forward compared to previous 3D platformers? Well, hardware plays a role here, or at least partially. Mario 64 was shipped on a cartridge, and whereas groundbreaking PlayStation games like Crash Bandicoot had to rely on cutting-edge data streaming techniques to push the hardware past its limits, the Nintendo 64's cartridge format allows level data to be loaded into memory so quickly that it's almost imperceptible. Look inside the game's data, and you'll find that it's incredibly compact and efficient. Take these ground textures featured in several levels in Mario 64. This stuff stretches out for virtual miles in front of the player at many points in the game, but if you look at the actual textures, they're really tiny. Coupled with the N64's built-in hardware anti-aliasing capability to stretch these textures as needed, this compactness of design allowed Nintendo to create massive in-game worlds using a minimal amount of system resources. But what really sets Mario 64 apart from the competition is its smart evolution of platformer design. Looking back at Crash Bandicoot, you can see that the game presents a pretty straightforward and obvious solution to the task of bringing side-scrolling platformers into 3D. Crash still runs forward and jumps over bottomless pits, much in the same way that Mario did back on Nintendo's 8-bit and 16-bit hardware. He just has a little bit of wiggle room as he travels forward. Nintendo, in contrast, decided to focus on the Z-axis. Look at Mario 64's levels, and you'll see that most of them feature an element of verticality. This effectively retains the appeal of 2D platformers while minimizing possible frustration points like bottomless pits and instant death traps. This shift in design philosophy was essential, since most new N64 owners wouldn't just be playing a 3D platformer for the first time, but they'd also be coming to grips with controlling a character in a 3D space using an analog stick. Look at the early levels of Mario 64 and you'll see a conscious effort to minimize potential sticking points with regard to control. The Castle Hub World and Bob-omb Battlefield have no bottomless pits whatsoever. In your first hour of play, the worst setback you're likely to face will be falling off the mountain in Bob-omb Battlefield, and even then it just takes a few seconds to climb back up. Mario 64's unconventional structure also played a big part in its success. Looking back again at previous 3D platformers like Crash Bandicoot and Jumping Flash, each level in these games is designed for the player to complete in a linear fashion. Sure, you can explore the environments in Jumping Flash for power-ups, and Crash encourages players to return to previous levels to break all the crates to earn collectible crystals, but for the most part these levels are designed to be quickly traversed, beaten, and forgotten. Compare that to Mario 64, where each level has multiple objectives to complete as players earn stars to progress. Not only does this cleverly reuse existing assets, but it recontextualizes them, creating a variety of challenges for players within complex environments that gradually become more familiar as they're repeatedly explored. Take the first world, for instance. By the time you've fully beaten Bob-omb Battlefield, you'll have climbed a mountain, beaten a boss enemy, ran a foot race, blasted off into the sky, freed a gigantic chain chomp, and fully explored every inch of the level geometry in search of 100 coins for the final star. This kind of variety allows first-time players to fully acquaint themselves with Mario's movement mechanics by the time they're done, while also making for an incredibly lengthy and complex level in its own right. Later worlds up the ante with the introduction of bottomless pits and deadlier challenges in general, and by the time you reach the final Bowser stage, the ground beneath you disappears entirely. It's a testament to Mario 64's sheer environmental variety that players are able to go from the laid-back challenges of Bob-omb Battlefield to the demanding platforming of the game's final hours without feeling like they're hitting a wall in terms of challenge at any point. Even taking all that into account, Mario 64 is filled with minor details that give the game a ton of personality, and stuff like that is what really makes it memorable decades later. So, while Super Mario 64 can trace some of its design back to the PlayStation, it's actually a combination of hardware horsepower and a profound shift in design philosophy that made it the landmark game that it is today. Super Mario 64 is one of those games that actually makes its predecessors seem even more impressive in hindsight, considering the limitations they were working under. Once Mario 64 was released, developers on all platforms began to take inspiration from it for their own projects. But even back when there was no template to work from, the 3D platformer designs that developers produced were still fascinating. Jumping Flash in particular holds up surprisingly well, and its precise controls and vertically oriented level design make it a unique and satisfying challenge. Crash Bandicoot paved the way for future PS1 platformers like Spyro, which took the genre in a distinctly different direction from Nintendo's games. Even Floating Runner is impressive just in terms of ambition, and nowadays we can think of it as an alternate take on 3D platforming, even though it's also kind of an evolutionary dead end. And then there's Bubsy 3D, which, hey, you know what? These water levels really do remind me of Super Mario 64. Good job, Bubsy. Good job. For as popular as the Nintendo 64 was, early adopters didn't have many games to choose from. Players in the United States and Europe could pick up Super Mario 64 and Pilotwings 64 at launch, but Nintendo fans in Japan got an additional launch title that was never released in other regions. It's Saikyo Habu Shogi. Yep, we sure missed out on this one. If you're unfamiliar with Shogi, it's a strategic board game that descended from the same ancient ancestor game as Western chess, and many pieces have direct chess equivalents. There's one piece that moves like a bishop, another that acts like a rook, and this one moves like the horsey. At the same time, there's plenty of additions that set Shogi apart from chess. Many of the pieces can be promoted once they reach the opposing side of the board, giving them more movement options. And in what's probably the biggest difference between the two games, you can actually deploy enemy pieces that you've captured and add them to your own side. This rule in particular is what makes stalemates rare in Shogi compared to chess. Saikyo Habu Shogi is significant for a few reasons. For one, it's the first third-party published Nintendo 64 game. Seta published this one, following up on the company's many previous Shogi and Mahjong releases for the Super Famicom. Over in the United States, they were also responsible for publishing stuff like Castle of Dragon, Q-Billion, and that awful SNES Wizard of Oz game. Saikyo Habu Shogi is also the first celebrity-endorsed Nintendo 64 game, since it features the likeness of a pro Shogi player. The Habu part of the title refers to its cover star, Yoshihara Habu, who was fresh off of winning all 7 of Japan's major Shogi championships earlier in 1996. So in terms of star power, he was a pretty good get, you know, as far as Shogi players go. A year earlier, he starred in Tomi's Habu Meijin no Omoshiro Shogi, or Master Habu's Interesting Shogi, for the Super Famicom, so he was no stranger to the world of video games at this point. Now, while Habu is a master of his craft, I haven't been to chess club since elementary school, and I don't even know where to start with Shogi. To the game's credit, there's plenty of tutorials and hints for beginners, and there's a mode that lets you replay matches step by step and save them to an N64 controller pack. In fact, Saikyo Habu Shogi was the first N64 game to make use of controller packs instead of internal battery backup for save data. But, as you might expect, all the menus are in Japanese, and they use a lot of specialized kanji, so the language barrier here is pretty high. I'm not really sure how much of an improvement this game is over 16-bit Shogi games either. Prior to Saikyo Habu Shogi's release, Seta made vague promises about using the N64's processing power to produce better Shogi AI, but any improvements here are lost on me. And while the board and pieces are in full 3D and can be viewed from a variety of angles, the frame rate is lower than you might expect for a game with such a simple graphical presentation. Players in Japan were also apparently underwhelmed when the game originally launched. Visiting Tokyo in 2009, games writer Chris Kohler saw one store giving away entire shipping boxes full of Saikyo Habu Shogi, free of charge. These brand new copies couldn't even be sold when they were clearanced out at 50 yen. The game had apparently been hanging around shops for quite a while at that point. Kohler goes on to explain that whereas Super Mario 64 had a 1-to-1 sales ratio with Nintendo 64 consoles at launch in Japan, console tie-in sales for Saikyo Habu Shogi were apparently more like 100-to-1. So it was a major flop and a blight on Japanese retailers for decades after its release. Big deal! Saikyo Habu Shogi has exactly one redeeming feature, and it's this amazing collection of Sears Portrait Studio shots of its cover star. I love how it rolls in a different one every time you bring up the screen. I could do this forever. Man, there's a lot of these. This ROM's gotta be like 10% Shogi pieces and the rest of it's just this guy's face. So yeah, aside from that one excellent feature, Saikyo Habu Shogi is otherwise best known as Super Mario 64's forgotten launch partner in Japan. But it wasn't all bad news. Seta's work apparently impressed Nintendo, and the two companies later collaborated to develop the Alex 64, an arcade board based on Nintendo 64 hardware that powered a dozen games released between 1998 and 2003. And almost immediately after Habu Shogi's release, Seta announced a sequel, Morita Shogi 64, which launched in 1998 with a modem connection port on the cartridge, allowing for online play. But let's be real here, which would you rather have? Online play? Or the Habu family photo album? In 1991, Pilotwings launched alongside the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in North America, delivering both a showcase for the new console's capabilities as well as an alternative to Nintendo's latest Mario game. 5 years later, Pilotwings 64 served pretty much the exact same purpose on the Nintendo 64. As we mentioned in the previous episode of N64 Chronicles, the Nintendo 64's launch lineup was extremely limited in both the US and Japan, and with Saikyo Habu Shogi not being an option for localization, Super Mario 64 and Pilotwings 64 were the only games available to N64 early adopters after launch in North America. Pilotwings 64 had the deck stacked against it from the beginning. Throughout 1996, Nintendo pooled most of its internal resources into developing Super Mario 64, leaving few of its staff free to work on other projects. Behind the scenes, Nintendo had also started work on games like Wave Race 64 and Mario Kart 64, and the company planned a slate of additional titles it would publish in cooperation with third-party developers, including Cruisin' USA and Killer Instinct Gold. But none of these games would be finished by the time the N64 was set to launch in North America or Japan, and while Pilotwings was a hit on the Super NES, the flight simulation genre wasn't exactly Nintendo's main area of expertise. In fact, the original Pilotwings had a rocky and unfocused development history, and it required some major last-minute changes just so it could make the SNES's launch window. Let's take a quick look at the original Pilotwings to see how it beat the odds to become a classic. Pilotwings is a flight simulation game in which players earn virtual pilot's licenses by completing various challenges across light plane, skydiving, rocket belt, and hang gliding events. The game was originally unveiled all the way back in December of 1988 as Dragonfly, which featured a playable biplane and what looks like simulation-oriented gameplay. This was also when the Super Famicom itself was first shown to the press, and Dragonfly offered up a showcase of its hardware scaling and rotation capabilities. Months passed, and by the time Dragonfly resurfaced in the July 1989 issue of Famicom Tsushin, it looked like a completely different game. The on-screen flight gauges were replaced with shield indicators, ammo canners, and a targeting reticle, and players now controlled a Dragonfly character who dropped bombs on ground targets. And yet, the sim-oriented biplane segments were still part of the game. Dragonfly had somehow diverged into both a serious flight game and an action-oriented shooter. As development entered its second year, Dragonfly's scope was spiraling out of control, and major compromises were needed before it could be ready for retail release. So the Dragonfly character concept was scaled back and repurposed for the helicopter bonus levels, while more realistic flight simulation challenges formed the core of Pilotwings' gameplay. And as if a major design overhaul wasn't enough of a setback already, by the time the project finished up, Nintendo's developers found that it actually wasn't possible to run Pilotwings on stock SNES hardware. So in a move that predates the invention of the SNES's Super FX and SA1 chips, Nintendo produced a unique circuit board for Pilotwings that featured a digital signal processor, the same chip that would later power the split-screen gameplay seen in Super Mario Kart. By the time it was finally ready for market, Pilotwings was burdened with both an extended development period and additional onboard hardware that couldn't even be acknowledged by marketing, as that might expose the SNES console's limitations and establish negative expectations right out the gate. Oh, and by the way, this is all for a game in a genre that at the time was entirely new to Nintendo's Entertainment Analysis and Development Division, or EAD. Now, EAD had a proven track record with classics like Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda, but experience within those genres doesn't necessarily transfer over to the field of flight simulation. The Super Famicom's launch was approaching fast and time was running out. Nintendo needed Pilotwings to be both a believable simulation and fun to play, and the project, as they say, was coming in hot. And yet, against all odds, Pilotwings successfully landed within a month of the Super Famicom's launch in Japan, and it was a big hit when the Super Nintendo premiered in August of 1991. Its attempts at representing concepts like velocity and momentum were pretty convincing for a console game at the time, and the laid-back flight school aesthetic and chill soundtrack did their part to keep you from flipping out after the 20th time you failed to land the goddamn plane! But yeah, Pilotwings earned a unique place in Nintendo's history, and it remains one of the most memorable early releases for the Super NES and Super Famicom. Fast forward 5 years, and Nintendo EAD had scaled up to 3D game production. Having just wrapped development of Super Mario 64, much of its creative staff immediately shifted to working on other first-party projects, and there was little hope that Nintendo EAD could produce a Pilotwings sequel that was both as groundbreaking and as playable as the original game, or at least not without some help. Enter Paradigm Simulation, a Texas-based computer graphics company that specialized in military training applications and virtual reality. It's interesting to note that Paradigm wasn't actually a video game developer at the time. Rather, it produced realistic simulators for its partner companies, including Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and NASA. Nintendo was impressed with Paradigm's work, and took particular note of its experience with silicon graphics technology, which coincidentally formed the backbone of the Nintendo 64's console hardware. Seeing an opportunity, Nintendo invited Paradigm to be part of its dream team of partner developers and publishers who had pledged their support for the N64. Paradigm agreed, and that's how Pilotwings 64 was produced in a once-in-a-lifetime partnership between a Texas flight simulation studio and Nintendo EAD in Japan. Pilotwings 64 reviewed well at launch here in the States. Next Generation actually gave it 5 stars, the same score it gave Super Mario 64. They claimed that its graphics were the most impressive 3D ever seen on a console. Electronic Gaming Monthly was a little bit less enthused, but still gave it a gold award for averaging a score above an 8 out of 10. Reviewer Dan Shu downplays it as a visually updated version of the old Pilotwings, but admits that it's a solid title that'll be worth your cash. Spelled with a $sign? GameFan also gave Pilotwings 64 high marks, praising it as the correct way to make a game, whatever that means. Indeed, Nintendo had corrected many of the original game's flaws, and Pilotwings got a massive graphical upgrade on its way to the Nintendo 64. The Mode 7 backgrounds are now 3D rendered maps that feature rocky terrain and realistic hills and valleys, in addition to environmental details like skyscrapers and industrial structures. The game world actually feels populated and lived in this time around. It's a pretty obvious upgrade from 16-bit consoles, and it's a very capable demonstration of the N64's graphical capabilities. Gameplay-wise, Pilotwings 64 is pretty fun. Like the original game, you're given control over several aircraft, and it has a variety of events in which you're judged for speed, accuracy, and whether or not you crash the plane again! One thing you might notice right away is that Pilotwings 64 is much more lenient in terms of how you progress through classes. The Super Nintendo Pilotwings used passwords, and players needed to get passing grades across multiple challenges in a row to progress. For instance, you could perform well on the first 3 events of Stage 4 with Big Al, but if you end up crashing your vehicle in the final test, you'll fail the entire course, and you'll need to complete the first 3 challenges all over again. Plus, you'll make Big Al cry. In Pilotwings 64, your best score is recorded in every single event via battery backup, and you can retry individual challenges without rolling back your progress in each class. This is a really good change that reduces frustration without impacting the overall difficulty level. At the same time, Pilotwings 64 doubled down on some of my least favorite parts of the original game. I didn't much enjoy the hang glider events in the original Pilotwings because of how unintuitive it is to control. At least the hang glider isn't introduced until the 3rd stage, giving you more time to acquaint yourself with vehicles that are much easier to control. But Pilotwings 64 starts throwing hang glider missions at you right at the beginning of the game, and these events make up roughly 1/3 of the total number of challenges on the cartridge. Despite Nintendo's efforts, the hang glider is still easily the weakest part of the game. The glider missions just aren't that interesting. Most of them ask you to ride air currents to reach a certain altitude, and then you land. Exciting. And these levels take forever! You'll feel your eyes glaze over as you stare at your character's 4-polygon butt, waiting for the glider to slowly reach the next gust of wind in the distance. And I still don't know how landing works. It only uses one button, and yet it's still really hard to touch down without slamming into the ground and breaking your pilot's legs. Broken bones are a score penalty, by the way. What's interesting is that Nintendo and Paradigm tried to add some variety to the hang glider levels with the addition of photography, long before Pokemon Snap turned that into a primary gameplay mechanic. You can take half a dozen shots during each mission, and you can save your favorites to the cartridge memory. Each challenge gives you 1 or 2 landmarks to photograph before you land, and afterward you're rewarded points based on the quality of the photo. This game doesn't have as in-depth a scoring system as Pokemon Snap, though, and the game is kind of vague about whether it prefers centered shots or larger subjects. Still, I'd consider these to be the best of the hang glider missions. They often lead to some pretty silly moments, like when you fly a little bit too close to that fireball you're supposed to photograph. Nah, he's fine. The gyrocopter, meanwhile, improves on the light plane mechanics from the original Pilotwings, but it still has some of the same problems. The main one being that it's a fragile thing, so you need to be very careful with landing. And even if you can touch down without destroying the landing gear, you can still end up with a low score due to impact or not being centered with the runway. And oh man, let me show you how bad I am at landing this thing. Blowing a landing at the end of a 5-minute mission is basically the worst. I'm the worst. I don't like this. Otherwise, the bulk of your challenges in the gyrocopter segments involve flying through rings, much like in the original Pilotwings. Interestingly, the gyrocopter also has an unlimited supply of missiles on board that you can fire by pushing the Z button. There's a handful of missions that require you to launch missiles at targets, which I guess is kind of a callback to the helicopter bonus levels in the original Pilotwings. The thing is, you can fire your weapons anytime you pick the gyrocopter, even in levels that don't have any missile targets. So if you're having a bad run, you can take out your frustrations on everything around you. Up yours, Fountain. I've got a whale of a tail for you. Eat ship and die! I'm coming for you, Mario! Oh my god. In later plane missions, Pilotwings 64 goes full sci-fi and makes you fight Mecha Hawk, a giant robot who rampages across the countryside and throws rocks at you. These can be pretty fun, even if you spend most of your time lining up shots rather than actually shooting stuff. Mainly I just like the way he yells when you shoot him. The rocket belt was my favorite event in the original Pilotwings, and I'd say the same about Pilotwings 64. Compared to the other vehicles, the rocket belt gives you much more immediate control over your flight path, and it's really fun to try and finish challenges as fast as possible without slamming into cliffs or buildings. It takes some practice to master, and some of the challenges are kinda weak, but otherwise the rocket belt is a ton of fun. I especially like one of the last missions where you need to fly through a massive underground cavern. It's challenging, but the controls are precise enough to make it really satisfying to speed through. There are also bonus challenges you can unlock by getting silver medals for all craft in each class. Skydiving returns from the original Pilotwings, and there's new levels featuring a cannon and whatever a jumble hopper is. The cannon's fun, but it's not super replayable after you know the right angles to dial in. And while I'd love to try the jumble hopper, I've already put dozens of attempts into some of these events, and there's no way you're gonna make me stare at the back of that hang glider for another minute. So Pilotwings 64 is kind of uneven, and overall I didn't like it as much as the original Pilotwings. It's not a bad game though, and in many ways it's an improvement. There's more variety to the events, and the new cast helps to add some personality. Speaking of which, one of the few localization changes between the US and Japanese versions of Pilotwings 64 was a disagreement over this character's name. In the US version, she's called Robin, but in the original Japanese release, she's named Hooter?
Oh yeah.
Back in our last episode, we mentioned that Japanese Nintendo 64 launch title Habu Shogi sold roughly 1 copy for every 100 N64 consoles sold in Japan. Pilotwings 64 fared a lot better, with some sources citing an attach rate of 1 copy for every 10 consoles sold, while others say it was as high as 1 in 4. The game was a hit on release in the Western world as well, and Paradigm Entertainment itself confirmed that Pilotwings 64 sold over 1 million copies worldwide by February of 1998. Though I've gotta wonder just how many of those copies were sold to people who had beaten Super Mario 64 and were tired of waiting for other new N64 games to come out. Nintendo's next release, Wave Race 64, wouldn't hit North America until November, and in total only 8 N64 games were available in the US by the end of 1996. But even if impatience was your main reason for buying Pilotwings 64 back in the day, you'd have still enjoyed a fun and unique piece of N64 history. Pilotwings 64 ended up being one of the N64's few flight sims, and while it doesn't quite hit the high bar that the original Pilotwings set in the SNES era, it's still a great companion piece to Super Mario 64, and a cornerstone of the N64's launch library. Well, there you have it. In retrospect, it's really no surprise that Pilotwings 64 and Habu Shogi were so greatly overshadowed by Super Mario 64. It's a giant leap forward in terms of 3D game design, and it remains relevant today, with speedrunners investing tons of time into routing and running the game across multiple competitive categories. In comparison, Pilotwings 64 and Habu Shogi show their age, and aren't nearly as well remembered today. Maybe my own biggest surprise from this series was seeing just how well Pilotwings 64 scored with reviewers in 1996. I can only imagine that the game's graphics must have been seriously impressive at launch, as otherwise it doesn't hold up nearly as well as Mario 64 in terms of gameplay. So what did you think of the N64's launch lineup? Was Mario 64 more than enough to tide you over until 1997? Or were you disappointed every time you went to look for new N64 games at KB and Babbage's and came up empty? Let us know, and thanks for watching N64 Chronicles. We also do a companion series called PlayStation Year 1, which covers every game released for the PS1 in its first year of release. You can subscribe to keep up with everything we do here, and if you want early previews of our latest videos, you can back us on Patreon. See you around!